because I knew in the end, people will get fed up and all these young feel nothing is ever happening. So of course they're going to get frustrated.
Under the gilded ceilings of Buckingham Palace, a storm was brewing. Whispers echoed through the marble halls. Queen Camilla, it was said, had her eye on treasures older than the monarchy itself. These priceless heirlooms, promised for Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, began to quietly vanish from their appointed place. But the watchful eyes of royal aides and a deeply concerned Prince William would change everything. What followed was a confrontation so tense, it shook the foundations of the royal household. Tonight, we reveal how King Charles made a decision that stunned the nation and ended Camilla's royal ambitions. A palace in turmoil. The summer light spilled through the tall sash windows of Buckingham Palace, casting long golden beams across the grand corridors. On the surface, the palace appeared calm, the kind of stillness that only the oldest royal residents could command. But behind those ornate doors and gilded picture frames, unease rippled quietly through the air. The atmosphere felt charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Palace insiders had begun to speak in hushed tones, their voices lowering when certain names were mentioned, glancing over their shoulders before continuing their conversations. Something was shifting within the royal household, and it was not the gentle change of tradition or ceremony. This was something more volatile. King Charles had always understood that the monarchy thrived on perception, outward dignity, seamless continuity. Yet lately there were murmurs of discord that threatened to fracture the carefully maintained image. They spoke of Queen Camilla with a note of caution, not about her public duties or her role beside the king, but about a private matter no one dared raise openly in the king's presence. In the shadowed recesses of the palace, stories began to emerge of certain valuable items being quietly moved from one wing of the royal residence to another. Items that did not belong to Camilla, but were part of a legacy earmarked for a future she did not represent. The treasures in question were not just sparkling trinkets or lavish antiques, they were tangible pieces of the monarchy's living history. A diamond tiara worn by queens past, a sapphire brooch that had survived wars and coronations, a pair of ornate silver candlesticks gifted to the royal family centuries ago. More than their monetary worth, these heirlooms carried the weight of promise. They were to be handed down to the youngest heirs, Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, as part of the heritage that defined their future roles. Their value was symbolic, anchoring them to a lineage that would one day rest on their shoulders. It was said the first signs of trouble began with a single locked cabinet in a lesser-used chamber. A royal aide, tasked with cataloging its contents for an annual inventory, noticed an absence where there should have been a diamond necklace of particular historical note. The absence was not a clerical error, it was deliberate. The aide reported it through the proper channels, but the response was delayed, as though the matter was too sensitive to address immediately. Time passed. More discrepancies appeared. A vase missing from the east wing, an embroidered gown from a former queen no longer in its protective case. Though no one dared accuse the queen directly, the whispers pointed in one direction. Camilla's private apartments were known to house many personal items, and it would have been simple to add a few more to the collection without drawing notice. But the royal household has long memories and sharper eyes than most imagine. In such a place, secrets rarely stay buried for long. And as the days passed, the murmurs grew louder, pressing ever closer to the king himself. A confrontation, it seemed, was becoming inevitable. The hidden legacy of the heirlooms. In the wake of those unsettling discoveries, the whispers that floated through Buckingham Palace began to take on a sharper edge. The missing items were not random trinkets or misplaced baubles. They belonged to a collection steeped in centuries of history, each piece a chapter in the story of the British monarchy. These were the heirlooms bound by tradition and promise, destined not for the present queen but for the youngest generation of royals. The palace corridors seemed to carry their history in silence, as if the objects themselves had once been witnesses to moments that shaped the kingdom. The legacy in question had been carefully curated over decades, locked away under layers of security and protocol. Among them was a pearl necklace that had once adorned Queen Victoria, said to have been a gift from her beloved Prince Albert. There was a diamond and emerald brooch worn by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, during state banquets, a piece whose sparkle caught the light in countless photographs that now sit in national archives. Perhaps most precious of all was a small, ornate crown crafted for a child monarch centuries ago, set with rare sapphires and rubies, its symbolism a quiet nod to the innocence and continuity of the royal line. These treasures were more than opulent relics. They were promises. In private, King Charles had spoken of his wish that certain pieces would be given to Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte when they were older, gifts not merely of beauty but of identity. The items were to anchor them in a legacy older than any living member of their family, a reminder that they were part of a line that had weathered wars, scandals, and transformations of the realm itself. In that context, their sudden disappearance was not simply a breach of protocol. It was an affront to the sanctity of royal heritage. The king's advisors knew the sensitivity of the matter. To address it publicly would be to invite questions the monarchy could not afford. To ignore it would be to risk losing pieces that could never be replaced. Behind the heavy oak doors of private meeting rooms, discussions grew tense. Theories circulated, some whispered in cautious tones, others bluntly spoken when they were sure no outsider could overhear. The name of the Queen surfaced often, always accompanied by a careful glance toward the door. Camilla herself maintained an air of composure, attending engagements with a steady smile and the poise expected of her station. But within the palace, the sense of quiet defiance in her gaze did not go unnoticed. To some, it was the look of a woman who believed she had every right to the items in question. To others, it was a sign she knew the walls were closing in. By now, the chain of whispers had reached the Prince of Wales. William had always been fiercely protective of his children's future, and the thought that part of their rightful legacy was slipping away stirred something resolute within him. What had begun as a silent disturbance was now gathering the force of an approaching storm, one that would soon reach the king's own desk. The Queen's quiet moves. By the time the murmurs had reached Prince William, the pieces of the puzzle had begun to fit together in unsettling clarity. The missing heirlooms, those irreplaceable treasures intended for Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte, were not vanishing in some chaotic shuffle of palace inventories. They were being moved with care and precision, as though each disappearance had been planned long before it was noticed. Within the labyrinth of Buckingham Palace, such things did not happen by accident. Those who had served the royal household long enough understood the subtle signs of possession. An object placed in a private sitting room rather than a secure vault. A piece of jewelry worn at a closed gathering where no cameras were present. A staff member summoned to quietly transport a trunk from the East Wing to the Queen's apartments, instructed not to list its contents. Camilla's approach was never brash. She did not storm into vaults or make overt claims. Instead, her methods were almost invisible, hidden under the daily rhythms of palace life, as if the treasures were merely being looked after for a time. What unsettled the older aides most was how smoothly these movements seemed to bypass the usual checks. The royal inventory system, maintained with near military precision, relied on signatures, permissions, and double verification. Yet more than once a record had been signed off by someone who later swore they had not seen the item in months. A footman recalled carrying a sealed box to Clarence House for temporary storage on the Queen's request, only to be told weeks later the box had never been logged as returned. There was an undeniable intelligence to the operation. Camilla knew that the royal household, despite its grandeur, functioned on relationships and unspoken understandings. A polite request from the Queen could outweigh the hesitation of any junior staff member. Her charm was her shield, and her position beside the king was her armor. But the older courtiers, those who had served through decades and multiple reigns, were not so easily swayed. They saw the pattern emerging and understood the stakes. Prince William's concern grew with each report that reached him. It was not greed that drove his unease, but the knowledge that the loss of these heirlooms would mean a loss of something sacred for his children. His conversations with his father were careful at first, framed in terms of ensuring the integrity of the collection and honoring the intentions of the late Queen. But Charles, ever cautious of confrontation within the family, preferred to tread lightly. The king was no stranger to palace politics. Yet this matter touched both the personal and the public in ways that left him torn. Meanwhile, Camilla moved as though nothing had changed. She attended charity galas, posed for official portraits, and presided over luncheons with dignitaries. But those closest to her noticed a faint shift. She had begun wearing certain pieces more frequently, not at grand state events, but in smaller, more private circles. A brooch at a luncheon with old friends, a bracelet during a casual weekend in the countryside. Always subtle, always away from the flash of photographers. For the staff who kept watch, it was like seeing the edges of a map being redrawn in real time. Every move hinted at a quiet consolidation of influence, a redefinition of what belonged to whom. And though the changes were almost imperceptible to the outside world, inside the palace, they signaled the slow but deliberate tightening of a grip that would soon be challenged. The storm William had sensed was no longer on the horizon. It was beginning to break, the watchful eyes of the royal staff. The storm that had begun to gather within Buckingham Palace did not come with thunder or lightning. It crept in silently, its presence felt in the subtle exchange of glances between footmen, the clipped tones of senior aides, and the unusually long pauses during routine briefings. For the royal staff, the palace was not just a workplace, but a living organism. They felt its mood change as surely as a sailor senses the shift of the wind. In recent weeks, the air had grown heavier. Something was unfolding that touched the very heart of the monarchy's most sacred traditions, and those tasked with guarding them could no longer ignore it. The first real alarm among the staff came when a housekeeper with 30 years of service noticed an unfamiliar arrangement in the Queen's private apartments. A pair of silver candlesticks, usually displayed only in the secure state dining room, now sat on a side table beside a vase of fresh roses. The change was small enough to pass without comment to an untrained eye, but for those who knew the precise placement of every object in the palace, it was a glaring irregularity. Within days, another staff member reported seeing a distinctive jewelry case, embossed with the royal crest, being discreetly carried toward the same apartments. No single incident could be called proof. But to the veterans of palace service, the pattern was impossible to miss. These were the same people who had spent decades ensuring that the crown jewels of heritage remained untouched, unless authorized. They had watched over these items through state visits, royal weddings, and even times of mourning. Now they felt as if they were witnessing a slow unraveling of the invisible cord that bound the royal family to its promises of stewardship. It was not merely the movement of the heirlooms that troubled them, but the ease with which it was happening. Access to certain vaults and storerooms was tightly controlled, often requiring the presence of two officials. Yet there were quiet accounts of orders being given in the Queen's name, instructions that bypassed the usual channels. The staff were torn between their duty to serve the monarchy and their loyalty to the King's wishes. To question the Queen directly was unthinkable, but to allow these changes to go unreported felt like a betrayal of the very history they had sworn to protect. In the staff corridors, conversations were guarded. Words were chosen carefully, often wrapped in the polite language of protocol. A missing brooch became temporarily misplaced. A vanished painting was in review for restoration. But behind the formality lay a growing unease. Some had begun keeping private notes, small ledgers of what had been moved and when, in case the day came when they would need to account for the loss. These quiet observers were not motivated by personal gain or ambition. They were the keepers of memory, the ones who knew that a crown was more than metal and jewels, and that a monarchy's strength rested not only in the pomp of ceremony, but in the integrity of its heritage. Their vigilance was the invisible shield that had protected the royal legacy for generations. And now, that shield was being tested. The whispers that had once been cautious and scattered were becoming threads in a single narrative, weaving their way toward the King's attention. It was no longer a matter of if he would be told, but when. And when that moment came, the staff knew the balance of power inside the palace would shift, perhaps forever. Prince William's private alarm. The moment the concerns reached Prince William, they did not arrive as dramatic accusations or bold claims. Instead, they came in the form of a quiet, measured conversation with a senior aide who had served his grandmother for decades. The aide spoke with the gravity of someone who understood both the weight of the information and the potential consequences of sharing it. He laid out the facts with meticulous care, describing the movements of the heirlooms, the irregularities in the logs, and the subtle yet unmistakable changes noted by the staff. William listened without interrupting, his expression calm but his mind already racing. He had always been aware of the delicate balance that kept the monarchy afloat. In public, the institution appeared as a united front, projecting continuity and stability. In private, it was a network of loyalties, traditions, and silent understandings that could fray if handled poorly. The matter at hand touched more than protocol. It was about safeguarding a legacy that belonged not to him but to his children. The heirlooms in question had been part of conversations with his father long before the late Queen's passing. They were meant to anchor Louis and Charlotte in the long arc of royal history, to give them tangible connections to the monarchs who had come before them. The thought of losing them unsettled him deeply, not for their monetary value but for the symbolism they carried. These were not mere possessions, they were markers of identity, part of the invisible armor that would one day help his children navigate the unique burdens of their roles. To see them quietly redirected elsewhere was to watch part of their inheritance slip into uncertainty. William chose his next steps carefully. He began by seeking confirmation from multiple sources within the palace, each time listening for the consistency in their accounts. The pattern was undeniable. Items had been moved to the Queen's apartments without the usual authorization, often under the guise of temporary safekeeping. Some of these pieces had even been seen worn or displayed in private settings far removed from their official place. The conclusion was clear. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate shift in possession. Confronting his stepmother directly would have been both premature and perilous. The risk of sparking a public rift was too great. Instead, William approached his father in the measured tone of a son who understood the weight of the crown. He spoke of heritage, of duty to the future, and of the promises made to the late Queen. He did not accuse. He simply laid out the facts and asked what could be done to ensure the heirlooms remained protected. Charles's reaction was thoughtful but cautious. He listened, nodding slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. The king understood the implications, but he also knew the cost of an open confrontation within the family. To act too swiftly risked scandal. To do nothing risked the loss of irreplaceable treasures. His silence in that moment was not dismissal, but calculation. William left the meeting with a heavy awareness that the matter was far from resolved. The king had heard him, but whether he would act decisively was uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the clock was ticking. The longer they waited, the more difficult it would be to recover what had been taken. And deep down, William knew that the storm brewing inside the palace was inching closer to breaking. The tense confrontation. The conversation between father and son had left an unspoken tension lingering in the air, the kind that hung heavy in the halls of Buckingham Palace. King Charles was not a man given to rash decisions, but the matter of the heirlooms weighed on him more than he cared to admit. Each day that passed without action felt like a test of his authority, a silent question of whether he could protect the legacy entrusted to him. Eventually, the calculation ended. It could not be delayed any longer. The situation had crossed the threshold from rumor to undeniable reality, and now it required his voice. The setting for the confrontation was deliberately chosen. Charles summoned Camilla to one of the smaller drawing rooms in the palace, a place removed from the formal council chambers but steeped in history nonetheless. The room's walls were lined with oil portraits of past monarchs whose stern gazes seemed to watch the proceedings. Outside, the muffled sounds of the palace continued as usual, but inside the atmosphere was taut. The king's aides had withdrawn, leaving only the two of them. Charles began in the measured tone he reserved for matters of great sensitivity. He spoke of heritage first, recalling the weight of the promises made to the late Queen and the responsibility they both shared in preserving the monarchy's treasures. He explained that concerns had been raised about certain heirlooms, that their absence had been noted and their movement traced to her apartments. He did not shout, but his words carried the steady force of a man determined to be understood. Camilla listened without interruption, her posture straight, her expression controlled. When she finally responded, her voice was calm but edged with steel. She insisted that any items in her possession were being cared for, that she had only sought to ensure they were not forgotten or locked away to gather dust. She argued that as queen she had a right to enjoy certain pieces, and that her stewardship was no less valid than anyone else's. The exchange grew sharper as Charles pressed the point that these were not ordinary possessions. They were earmarked for the next generation, for Louis and Charlotte, and their removal from official custody jeopardized both their security and their symbolism. Camilla countered with quiet defiance, suggesting that the boundaries of tradition could be interpreted in more than one way. For a moment, the silence between them felt as though it could break the room in two. Charles, who had spent his reign so far navigating the delicate politics of family and duty, knew that whatever he decided next would send a message not just to Camilla, but to the entire household. In the end, his tone hardened. The heirlooms were to be returned to their rightful place in the royal collection, under lock and record, without exception. There would be no further ambiguity about their ownership or future. Camilla's eyes held his for a long moment before she gave a single nod, the kind that signaled compliance, but not concession. The meeting ended without ceremony, yet its echo traveled quickly through the palace corridors. Those who had been watching from the shadows understood that a line had been drawn. What they did not yet know was that this line would soon become the dividing mark in a much larger struggle for influence within the royal household, the royal ultimatum. Word of the confrontation spread through the palace faster than anyone could have anticipated. Not in public, not in headlines, but in the subtle exchanges that made up the private language of the royal household. The quiet nods between senior aides, the knowing glances passed in the servants' corridors, the brief silences that fell whenever the Queen entered a room. Something had shifted, and everyone who mattered knew it. King Charles had spoken, and his words had not been open to interpretation. For the king, the ultimatum had been more than a simple command. It was a declaration of his authority, a reminder that no matter how the monarchy had evolved, certain lines could not be crossed without consequence. In private, he instructed the keeper of the royal collection to conduct a discreet but thorough audit of the heirlooms. Every item with a disputed location was to be documented and returned to secure custody. The process was quiet but relentless, designed to leave no room for misunderstanding. Camilla outwardly gave no sign of distress. She continued her public engagements with poise, her smile as steady as ever, her manner composed. But those closest to her noticed a subtle change. She had become more guarded, her circle tighter. Fewer invitations were extended to informal gatherings, and her private apartments were less accessible than before. It was as though she had drawn an invisible curtain between herself and the rest of the household, a barrier meant to keep prying eyes at bay. Within the staff, the sense of relief was tempered by caution. The king's intervention had restored order, but no one could be certain it would hold. Power in the palace was rarely about single moments. It was about the quiet currents that shaped the long game. Camilla still held influence, and those who underestimated her resolve often found themselves surprised. For William, the king's decisive stance was a victory, but not a complete one. He knew his father's words had set boundaries, yet he also understood that boundaries could be tested over time. The heirlooms might be safe for now, but vigilance would be essential. He made it clear to a select few trusted aides that the matter was not closed in his mind, and that any future irregularities were to be brought to him immediately. In the days that followed, the royal collection was restored to its full integrity. The pearl necklace, the sapphire brooch, the silver candlesticks all returned to their rightful places. The ornate child's crown, perhaps the most symbolic of all, was placed under special guard. Yet even as these items were locked away, the atmosphere in the palace remained taut. The ultimatum had settled the immediate dispute, but it had also left behind an unspoken tension, a reminder that trust once strained is not easily mended. King Charles had drawn his line. Whether it would stand unchallenged was a question that only time could answer. And in the quiet, gilded halls of Buckingham Palace, time has a way of testing every resolve. Camilla's swift exit. In the wake of the king's ultimatum, the palace settled into a brittle calm, the kind that feels more like a pause between waves than the arrival of peace. Officially, everything was back in place. The heirlooms were accounted for, the ledgers balanced, the keeper of the royal collection satisfied that order had been restored. But beneath the polished surface, the tension had not eased. If anything, it had deepened. The Queen's presence, once a constant in the royal residences, began to thin. Engagements that would have kept her within the walls of Buckingham Palace were quietly rescheduled or moved elsewhere. It began subtly. A long weekend spent at Ray Mill House, her private home in Wiltshire, stretched into a week. Meetings that might have required her presence in London were handled by phone or deferred to aides. Soon, she was spending more nights away from the palace than within it. The official explanation was that she valued time in the countryside, that it allowed her to focus on charitable projects and personal commitments. But those who had watched the drama unfold saw it differently. There was no dramatic departure, no suitcase wheeled down a marble staircase. Instead, her absence became a steady fact, a quiet withdrawal from the heart of royal life. The apartment she had made her own remained sealed to all but a handful of trusted staff, their contents untouched since the heirlooms had been returned. The corridors that once carried the sound of her footsteps now stood silent. For King Charles, the change was a mixed relief. The confrontation had risked a fracture in their marriage, yet it had also reasserted the authority he could not afford to lose. Camilla's absence from the palace removed the immediate source of tension, but it also left a void in the daily rhythm of his private life. Still, he made no move to compel her return. To the outside world, nothing appeared amiss. Public events continued, photographs were taken, and the monarchy's image remained intact. But inside the palace, those who knew the truth understood that Camilla's gradual retreat was not merely a preference for country air. It was a retreat from a battle she had not won, a calculated distance from the center of power that had, for the moment, closed ranks without her. And in the world of royalty, absence could be as telling as presence, protecting the royal future. With Camilla spending more time away from Buckingham Palace, a subtle but noticeable shift began to take place within the royal household. The air, once charged with the quiet tension of competing wills, seemed lighter, though the memory of recent events lingered in every gilded corridor. King Charles, now unencumbered by the daily friction of proximity, turned his attention to ensuring that the heirlooms at the heart of the dispute would remain beyond the reach of any future challenges. The keeper of the royal collection worked closely with senior aides to create a more robust system of oversight. Items of particular importance were placed under additional layers of security, their locations verified not just by logbooks but by photographic evidence and periodic inspection. Access to these treasures became more limited than ever before, granted only to those whose loyalty and discretion had been proven over decades of service. The ornate child's crown, the pearl necklace, the sapphire brooch, each was sealed away with the understanding that they would one day pass to Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte as part of their inheritance, untouched and unaltered. Prince William, though outwardly focused on his public duties, quietly took on the role of guardian for his children's legacy. His visits to the vaults were discreet, but the staff who managed them understood his purpose without it being spoken. He was there to see with his own eyes that the promises made were being kept. The memory of how close they had come to losing parts of that heritage remained a quiet motivator, pushing him to ensure that history would not repeat itself. Charles, for his part, was careful not to dwell on the rift with Camilla in public or private conversation. Their relationship, though tested, had not broken entirely, and both seemed willing to maintain a facade of unity for the sake of the monarchy's image. Yet the king's decision during the confrontation had left a permanent mark, a reminder to all within the palace that his ultimate loyalty was to the crown and its future custodians. In the stillness of certain evenings, when the palace was quiet and the bustle of official life had faded, the king would sometimes walk the long gallery where portraits of past monarchs lined the walls. He understood, perhaps more than ever, that his reign was not merely about the present moment, but about the threads of continuity that bound generations together. The heirlooms were more than objects. They were promises carved into the fabric of the monarchy itself, symbols of endurance in a world that constantly shifted. And so, with watchful eyes and renewed resolve, the royal household moved forward. The storm had passed, but the safeguards now in place ensured that the treasures meant for Louis and Charlotte would remain where they belonged, ready for the day when the next chapter of the monarchy would be theirs to write. In the end, the quiet battle over the royal heirlooms became more than a dispute about jewels and antiques. It was a test of loyalty, authority, and the delicate balance that holds the monarchy together. King Charles had drawn his line, and in doing so safeguarded a legacy for the youngest heirs. Camilla's retreat left questions unanswered, but the treasures remained where history intended them to be. In the centuries-old story of the British crown, this chapter will be remembered not for the scandal whispered in palace halls, but for the resolve that ensured the future stayed in rightful hands.